So my presentation today will proceed thusly. First, I'll offer some important historical context for understanding the interplay between race, particularly Blackness, criminality, and the law. Then I'll move to a discussion of the rhetorical situation of sketches of the life of Joseph Mountain. And the rhetorical situation are the circumstances that give birth to texts. And so I'll talk a little bit about how it came into being. Then I'll move into a pointed discussion of the text, the full title of which is Sketches of the Life of Joseph Mountain, a Negro, who was executed at New Haven on the 20th day of October, 1790, for a rape committed on the 26th day of May last. And we'll end with questions and answers from the audience. So to begin with a bit of historical context, it is important to note that race is the salient political category of governance when thinking about this era, thinking about Joseph Mountain, thinking about slavery, and thinking about gallows literature more broadly. And this political category had its roots in slavery and European colonialism. So around the 15th century, we see the rise of race as we currently know it, as well as the system of white supremacy. And so within this, racial slavery was a racialized power relation predicated upon white domination and Black subjection. So when you look historically, the category of slave often was synonymous with Black or Negro, increasingly so in the post-independence American era. And the enslaved were dually governed in law as both property and persons. And today I want to speak more about the nature of that personhood. So enslaved people bore all legal personhood's burdens, but very few of its benefits. And so reading scholar Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection, we learn that the slave was a legal person insofar as he was a criminal or a violated body in need of limited forms of protection. And those forms of protection most often served the needs and property interests of masters. So say, for example, someone other than an enslaved person, enslaver, caused them bodily harm or murdered them, then masters could ask for some type of compensation through the law. And so enslaved personhood served mostly as a pretext for punishment and the inroads of discipline, rather than that which confirmed the crime of slavery. So we see arising in the law and later in the legal context, this chain of associations between Black or Negro, slave, and criminal. And this chain of associations was not abolished upon the legislation of the so-called first and the second emancipations. And so some of you may be more familiar with the second emancipation, the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime. But well before 1865 in the US North, during the so-called first emancipation, we see similar laws being passed in states like Vermont that allow slavery as a punishment for a crime. And one of the most salient examples of how gradual abolition law in particular criminalized Black people, whether they were enslaved, escaped, or emancipated, is Pennsylvania's Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery. Now, most abolition laws in the North were gradualist in nature, and they did not free a single slave. Instead, what they legislated was that enslaved persons born before the dates of enactment would remain in bondage, and enslaved women's children born after the dates of enactment may be freed if they reached a certain age, depending on the state and their sex. So in Pennsylvania, for example, the law stipulated that enslaved women's children could acquire freedom at the age of 28. What's also really interesting about this law is that it contains the first known fugitive slave clause in an American code. And so there's a clause that prevents citizens of Pennsylvania from sheltering runaway slaves and demanding that they report and return enslaved people who have escaped. As well as this, In terms of the rights that the law accords to the emancipated, one of the main rights that it gives is that of a right to trial, right to a trial by jury for criminal offenses. So you don't really see much talk about giving Black people the right to vote, about protecting their property ownership, but it's really giving them the right to a trial by jury for criminal offenses. And so even for the emancipated, we see that their legal personhood is being framed within this rubric of criminality. And so Black personhood, whether fettered, fugitive, or freed, served as a legal and political category for criminalization and condemnation across the antebellum North, and as the more prevalent story tells us, across the post-emancipation South. So that's just a snapshot of some important historical context. And I now want to move into a discussion of the rhetorical situation. And when we talk about a rhetorical situation, again, these are the conditions under which texts come into being. They're writers involved in writing texts who are influenced by their own biography. They're writing to an audience for a specific purpose about specific topics and in particular contexts. So here we have Joseph Mountain, the condemned, who was born in Philadelphia in 1758 to an enslaved mother, and given the legal principle partus sequitur ventrum, meaning child follows belly, he was enslaved because he followed the condition of his mother. So he was enslaved by Samuel Mifflin, Esquire of Philadelphia. He sailed to London at the age of 17 with his master's permission. He traveled Europe and the Caribbean. He returned to the United States in 1789, and he ended up in New Haven. And shortly thereafter, he was convicted, tried, sentenced, and hanged at age 32 for the rape of Eunice Thompson, who was a white girl around the age of 13 or 14. So we also have David Daggett, the amanuensis or author of the texts. Now, Sketches of the Life of Joseph Mountain originally was published anonymously. However, most scholars credit Daggett as the amanuensis, and others would argue that he is the author. He himself wrote the text. And so Daggett was a representative in the Connecticut legislature. He was also a mayor of New Haven, a congressional senator, a chief justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court, a principal founder of Yale Law School. He also had documented anti-Black, anti-abolition, and pro-colonization ideologies. And he interviewed and imprisoned Mountain in 1790. So the first edition credits Mountain as the author, but an endnote in the original shows Daggett's compositional influence. And we get in the endnote this statement that the writer of the, foregoing narrative assures the public that the facts related were taken from the mouth of the culprit and that it contained nothing but the truth. But there's a reason to suspect that this story is not directly taken from the mouth of the culprit and is nothing but the truth. And we need to consider the ways that power is infused in the story. When we think about the disparate relationships to power that Daggett had versus that of Mountain, then we can understand how these dynamics of power, particularly within a context of racial slavery and anti-Blackness, are infused into the production of the story. And we do know that criminal confessions of the era usually were coerced, if not fabricated, and obtained extra-legally. So gallows literature is the genre to which Sketches of the Life of Joseph Mountain belongs. And these are sermons, moral discourses, narratives, last words, and dying sayings and poems written for, by, and about persons executed for criminal activity. They first emerged around 1674 and were very popular in New England. And you can find gallows literature published well up to the Civil War. They were published as part of the rituals of public execution days. And so in early America, public executions took place outside. Eventually, they did move indoors. And appended to these gallows literature, you could find things like other documents like execution sermons. And we know that for Mountain, Dr. Dana's sermon at the execution of Joseph Mountain is often appended to the sketches. So there are about 60 condemned Black people in gallows literature, and they are very disproportionately overrepresented in the genre. 1/3 of all early American gallows texts printed between 1674 and 1800 features a Black persona or protagonist, usually male. And 80% of men executed for rape between 1700 and 1820 were of African descent. Okay, so we see this huge disparity in terms of who gets accused, tried, convicted, and sentenced or executed for rape. Even though we don't see Black women as represented in gallows literature, Black women are also very disproportionately represented among the Black condemned. And in this article, historian Callie Gross tells the historical truth about women burned at the stake. And she begins with a story of a woman enslaved in New England, a one Maria, who was the first woman to suffer the fate of being burned to death. And her brutal death, Gross tells us, would prove to be the start of a grim pattern in American justice. And between 1608 to 2002, the overwhelming majority of women to face the fatal fires of justice were Black, to the tune of 87%. So you can see this drastic racial disparity in how the law is governing Black men and Black women as criminal. So the criminal and the slave were the most prevalent Black figures in early American print. And we see them represented in gallows literature and in the slave narrative most popularly or prevalently. And Sketches of the Life of Joseph Mountain was one of the most widely circulated and distributed gallows texts with a Black protagonist. The text was sold to the crowd at his execution, which was about 10,000 people. And it's estimated that the population of New Haven at the time was around 5,000. So the fact that you get a crowd of 10,000 people mean that you have people traveling from other parts of the state, other parts of the country to witness the execution. And I should state that this was not uncommon. You could find public executions with crowds well into the tens of thousands during the era. And we also know that there were subsequent editions of Sketches of the Life of Joseph Mountain published across New England, including an edition published in Hartford, as well as one published in Boston, and 2 German language editions published in Pennsylvania. So it had a broad geographical circulation. What's interesting about Sketches of the Life of Joseph Mountain's rhetorical situation as well is that his text was not the first purported to be a criminal confession of a Black man accused of rape, but there is a sharp increase in gallows literature featuring Black men convicted of rape following the publication of Sketches of the Life of Joseph Mountain in 1790. And scholar Brian Bakke tells us that this text is central for thinking about the emergence of a central figure in American culture, specifically that of the mythologized Black rapist. So having given some historical context and rhetorical situation, I now turn to a discussion of the text itself. And this frontispiece, or this title page of Sketches of the Life of Joseph Mountain, is from one of the original editions published in New Haven, courtesy of the Beinecke. And you'll note this particular iconography of death on the title page here with the skull and crossbones bordering the page. And it was not uncommon to see this type of imagery in early gallows literature. There were also pictures of coffins and pictures of gallows. And later, as print technologies became more advanced, one could see more detailed illustrations on these title pages or for the frontispieces of gallows literature, many of which really sensationalized crime and purported to represent criminals sort of caught in the act, right, in the middle of committing a murder or committing a robbery. But this piece here is very conventional of the earlier gallows literature. So I want to talk more pointedly for the remainder of my time about race and racism in the text. So we know that race and racism structure the historical context and the rhetorical situation of sketches of the life of Joseph Mountain. But do race and racism feature in the body of the text? So we see race and racism appearing in a number of different ways. The first is what I call the racialized theatricality of criminality. Sorry, take this automatic timer off. And so we know that Englishmen Francis Hyde and Thomas Wilson are two men whom Mountain met when he first traveled at the age of 17 to England, and they were jugglers by day and robbers by night. And he tells us that Hyde and Wilson were dressed in white frocks and boots with their faces painted yellow to resemble mulattoes whenever they committed crimes. And Mountain was dressed in the same manner, with the addition of a large tail wig, white gloves, and a black mask over his face. So we see them presenting themselves as mulattoes, these white men, while in the commission of crimes. We also see a representation of interracial marriage in the text. In 1780, when Mountain is approximately 21 years old, the narrative relays, I became acquainted with a Miss Nancy Allingame, a white girl of about 18 years of age, and she had some personal property and a house, which the narrative states Mountain exhausted when he married her, and he left her destitute and sent her back home to live with her father. And so there's an interesting note to this passage that reads, the reader will please to recollect that Negroes are considered in a different point of light in England from what they are in America. The Blacks have a far greater connection with the whites, owing to the idea which prevails in that country that there are no slaves. So this is the note appended to the description of the interracial marriage. We also see the transatlantic slave trade appear in sketches of the life of Joseph Mountain. In 1784, when he was approximately 26 years old, the narrative states, I quitted London, went on board an European vessel, and made a voyage to Grenada. From this period till August 1789, I was employed as a sailor, during which time I made 2 voyages to the coast of Guinea and brought cargoes of Negroes to Jamaica. Okay, so he talks about being on this at least 2 slave voyages. It's interesting, though, that in the narrative, the rhetoric of rape, for all of the racialization of this rhetoric in the historical context, and in many of the rhetorical situations of gallows literature, the way that it's represented in the body of the text of sketches of the life of Joseph Mountain is really not racialized. So the narrative mentions the unhappy girl whom Mountain so wantonly injured. And the narrative describes her as an innocent girl. So we get these references to age. Recall she was 13 or 14 at the time. And then when it comes to the section where he purportedly confessed, this is what the narrative states. I have uniformly thought that the witnesses were mistaken in swearing to the commission of a rape, that I abused her in a most brutal and savage manner, that her tender years and pitiable shrieks were unavailing, and that no exertion was wanting to ruin her, I frankly confess. So you have this fraught confession in which, on the one hand, he states that witnesses have to be mistaken in calling this rape. But then on the other, he says that he brutally and savagely assailed her, and that he frankly confesses to the fact that he attempted to ruin her. And so this fraught rhetoric is, again, I think points back to some of those problems concerning the rhetorical situation of the confession and the conditions under which it was solicited, and whether the confession itself may have been coerced. So it's interesting, though, that even though the rhetoric of rape in the body of the narrative itself refers more to age and to the girl's innocence makes no mention of her race, that a lot of the press surrounding Mountain's trial, as well as his execution, is highly and very often inflammatorily racialized. So we see, for example, the Connecticut Journal, which was the preeminent newspaper that covered the trial, published on June 2nd, 1790, Wednesday last in the afternoon, a rape was committed on the body of a white girl, about 14 years old, by a transient Negro aged about, it's supposed to say 30. So here they mention the girl's race, and they describe Mountain himself as a quote unquote transient Negro. So a Black man who has no home in Connecticut, and he was indeed traveling on his way to New York when the alleged incident occurred. And the Independent Chronicle of August 12th, 1790, also writes, a transient Negro man, there's that description again, was brought to trial before the Superior Court for committing a rape on the body of a white girl of about 14 years of age, and was found guilty and sentenced to death. And so when looking at the newspaper coverage, as well as the address of the court, there's a lot of inflammatory racial rhetoric, a lot of discussion of the quote unquote savagery with which Mountain acted, a lot of depictions of him of being very lustful, very lewd, very depraved, unfit for society, and worthy of nothing but death, 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 as the final pronouncement states. So having gone through some of these representations of the rhetoric of rape, as well as the language of race and racism, I now want to turn to critically rereading race and racism in the text. And I want to do so by engaging in a method of reading that Saidiya Hartman describes as reading against the grain, using sources like gallows literature to write different accounts of the past, while also recognizing their limitations and the impossibility of fully recovering the experiences of the enslaved and the emancipated. And so, though the text was produced in such a fraught rhetorical context and in such a fraught historical context and rhetorical situation, can we read it in another kind of way, contrary to the purposes of gallows literature generally, which was to show the criminality of Black malefactors, to get them to confess, and to show them worthy of the condemnation by the state. And I think there's some very interesting moments in the narrative where we can read against the grain. And so it's important to remember that in this historical context, even though crime is very often something that the law disproportionately accords to Black people, you have people who tell a very different kind of story. And Black and white abolitionists alike, when they refer to crime, they often refer to the crimes of racial slavery and the crimes of white polities committed against Black people. And so you may find, for example, Hosea Easton, who was a native of New England and preached in Massachusetts and Connecticut. He wrote a book called A Treatise in 1837. And he writes that European colonizers crossed the Atlantic like a cloud of locusts towards the West and practiced the same crime that they had practiced in pre-colonial Europe, namely enslaving one another. And so he traces the genealogy by which these colonizers gradually racialized slavery, such that Africans and their descendants become the main people whom the institution subjects. And he talks about the crimes that slave traders engaged in, namely robbing Africa of her riches and honor, and her sons and daughters to the glut and rapacity of the great minds of European bigots. Likewise, we have William Armistead, who in his A Tribute to the Negro writes about the most extraordinary system of crime the world ever witnessed, which has now been in operation for several centuries and which continues to exist in unabated activity. And that is Negro slavery. And so here we get him framing the institution of slavery as the most extraordinary crime that humanity has ever seen. And as I stated earlier, slavery was racialized and predicated upon white domination and Black subjection. So most of the perpetrators of the crimes of slavery would have been white enslavers. And so we have people like Hosea Easton and William Armistead pointing to this white criminality that is left largely unculpable in the face of the law, right? Because slavery, slave trading have the sanction of law. Even after the slave trade undergoes formal abolition in 1808, we still see the trade continuing well into the 19th century. And in fact, New England, particularly the state of Rhode Island, is the epicenter for the illegal trade. So returning to sketches of the life of Joseph Mountain, there are different moments here where we can rethink or reframe the narrative of the relationship between race and crime. And so it's interesting that he names Pennsylvania's white polity, including the governor, as perpetrators of the crimes of slavery. And I should state, even though he states that his master is the father of Thomas Mifflin, who was then governor of Pennsylvania, Samuel was not Thomas's father, but they were related. So it's interesting the way that he's pointing to this head of state, right, as whose family has Quaker ties as well, right, as being implicated in the crimes of slavery. He also implicates white Englishmen, particularly Hyde and Wilson, in initiating him, a 17-year-old Mountain, in practices disgraceful to human nature and destructive to every moral virtue. He positions himself as a witness to the crimes of slave trading on those 2 slave voyages he took part in. And interestingly, when Mountain resolved to quit this course of life, robbery, 2 other white Englishmen soon proposed that he should resume his profession. And notwithstanding the darkness of his complexion, he was complimented as the first of his profession and praised effusively by other highway robbers. So it's very interesting the way that Mountain gains a kind of celebrity status among highway robbers, and most of whom, if not all of whom, are white men. We also see a lot of corruption throughout different British social and political structures, including the fact that Mountain bribes a guard with 5 guineas to escape sea service for the British because he had been taken into service as a cook. And this is how he escaped, through bribing. He also names several white male business owners who keep houses for the reception of gamblers, swindlers, and footpads. And many of these owners were the persons who furnished Mountain with the tools of the trade of highway robbery. So with horses, with pistols. He also names Lord Gordon in inciting a mob of rioters against Catholics in London. And he talks about this discourse, this inflamed discourse of Protestantism that Lord Gordon proliferates. And he names him as implicated in getting several thousand rioters to burn down the houses of some Catholic residents. And it's interesting because the mob also provides cover for a range of different crimes committed by Mountain and his associates, including bank robbery. It's also important to note that in court, when he is tried for rape, that Mountain pleads not guilty to this crime, even though the narrative claims that he confessed. And so, having thought about the race and racism in this way, thinking about the way in which Mountain is implicating a number of different institutions, especially those in England, as implicated in criminality in some fashion or another, and the ways in which he himself has pleaded guilty and said that he can't believe people would describe what he did as rape. It begs a reconsideration of the ways in which the text represents the Black malefactor. And so in conclusion, the historical context and rhetorical situation that engendered sketches of the life of Joseph Mountain framed the Black malefactor, particularly the Black male rapist, as a figure of confessed criminal culpability whom the state has rightfully condemned to death. However, reading against the grain, the text invites analyses of the unindicted crimes of slave trading and racial slavery, as well as the culpability of states and white polities in denigrating and destroying Black lives. And so Mike began with a very important quote by James Baldwin that talks about the importance of reflecting on our past in order to understand the present in which we live. And it's very, very important when thinking about sketches of the life of Joseph Mountain and the broader historical context and rhetorical situation that engendered it, that when we look at our contemporary moment, we see that the disproportionate criminalization of Black life is still ongoing in our contemporary. And so to get a better sense of how deeply embedded the criminalization and condemnation of Blackness are in America's socio-political DNA, texts like Sketches of the Life of Joseph Mountain give us great insight. They also provide occasion for us to think more critically about who or what is committing crime in these instances. Thank you.